I stood near the airline counter, my heels sticking slightly to the airport carpet as the gate agent called out first-class boarding. Again. My son didn't look back. My daughter-in-law didn't even blink. She's not traveling with us. Her voice was sugar-sweet, but the words stung sharper than jet fuel in. After paying off his college loans, after flying cross-country for every milestone, after being the one who held his hand during his first panic attack, now I wasn't even worth a seat on the same plane. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Helen stood at the entrance to the narrow aisle, her pulse quickening as the flight attendant gestured her forward. The airplane cabin was a cramped battlefield of tension, the chattering of passengers a blur around her as she slowly shuffled toward her seat in the economy section. She'd been flying for years, but today felt different. Her 72 years seemed to weigh heavier than the softness of her shoes tapping lightly against the floor as she moved past row after row of tight, cramped seating. Then, she saw them. Michael and Vanessa, sitting in business class. Her son, staring out the window, his expression cold as if her presence was a mild inconvenience. Vanessa, smirking, caught her eye. Helen's breath caught. The humiliation flooded in as she hesitated, but only for a brief moment. It was the way Vanessa's lip curled upward, as though she had already won something. I hope you're not too uncomfortable down there. Michael's voice floated back to her, his tone light but biting. Vanessa let out a soft, mocking laugh. Maybe next time they'll bump you up to business, she whispered, her voice like a dagger in the quiet tension of the moment. The words fell heavy in the air, taunting. Helen wanted to say something, to lash out, but instead, she inhaled deeply. The muscles in her shoulders tightened, her back straightening, forcing herself to ignore the cold sting of shame. She focused on the flight attendant who smiled professionally as she guided Helen but Helen's eyes were drawn back to her son and daughter-in-law. They hadn't even looked away from each other. Helen felt her breath tighten in her chest, and for a split second, the years of judgment, of silent rejection, came rushing. They treated her like an afterthought, a nuisance, but she knew better than to let it show. Not today. Not ever again. As she slid into her seat in the cramped economy section, she glanced back at the business class area one last time. Michael and Vanessa were already engrossed in their conversation, their laughter cutting through her thin veneer of composure. Emily, her granddaughter, stood behind her. She was only 17, and the weight of this world was heavy on her young shoulders, but she had always been Helen's silent protector. Her hands fidgeted, but she didn't speak. She could feel the sting of the moment too, but stayed silent, just standing there for a moment longer than. Helen's heart softened at the sight of Emily. Her granddaughter's eyes held a mix of concern and frustration, but her lips were pressed tightly together, as if unsure how to shield her grandmother's cruelty. Helen wanted to reach out, to pull Emily close, to remind her that she was okay. But before she could, Grace, the flight attendant, approached. Her professional smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she bent down to speak quietly to Helen. "Ma'am, I'll be right back," Grace said softly, her voice low enough for only Helen to hear. The other passengers were absorbed in their own world, unaware of the subtle tension. Helen didn't say anything at first, though her heart beat faster. She knew that Grace had overheard the conversation between Michael and Vanessa. The humiliation wasn't just from them. It was from the look on the faces of the other passengers as they glanced at the elderly woman in the back of the. Grace was back moments later, her eyes scanning the row of seats before landing on. The flight attendant's voice cut through the hum of the cabin, her words clear and smooth. "We have a seat available in first class, if you'd like to take." Helen blinked. Her heart jolted as every eye in the cabin suddenly seemed to fixate on. There was a ripple of polite applause, the soft clapping of hands breaking the rhythm of the flight. For a brief moment, Helen stood frozen in the aisle, unsure of what was happening. Michael's face darkened as his eyes met hers. His jaw clenched, and the flush of anger rose in his cheeks. Vanessa barely suppressed a sneer, the briefest shift of her lips betraying her disgust. But Helen stood there, unmoved. Grace gestured toward the first-class cabin with a silent question in her eyes. A subtle nod from Helen. She had earned nothing in the eyes of her family, but today, she would reclaim her dignity. With a quiet determination, Helen stood and turned, letting the murmurs fade into the background. She felt the weight of her family's scorn, but she had done this before. This was not about the seat. It was never about this. It was about her, about who she was. She moved slowly, calmly toward the front of the plane, each step firm, her head high, her back straight. She passed her son's seat and heard Vanessa mutter under her breath, "She doesn't des-" Helen's smile was small, but it was there. She didn't speak, but the words in her mind were clear. Respect doesn't board last. When she reached the first-class cabin, the flight attendant helped her into the seat with a small, reassuring touch. Helen settled in, finally feeling the weight of the world ease just a little. There would be no victory for them today. Not this time. But the moment wasn't over. She glanced back toward the cabin, catching Emily's eye. Her granddaughter was standing there, watching her face full of pride. The flight attendant's voice came over the her words echoing in Helen's mind. The real prize wasn't the seat. It was the respect she had so long been denied. And in that moment, Helen knew, they may switch not my day. A soft, almost imperceptible tear slid down her cheek, but she wiped it away before anyone could see. Her fight had just begun. The plane had settled into its smooth mid-flight rhythm, the soft hum of the engines blending with the occasional rustle of newspaper and the faint clink of drink carts. Helen's eyes drifted to the window, her thoughts a quiet storm as she watched the endless stretch of clouds below. It felt like a different world out, one where she wasn't bound by the weight of judgment, where no one could tell her where she belonged or what she deserved. The seat was comfortable. Still, it wasn't the seat that mattered. This was about reclaiming something much deeper, something Michael and Vanessa never understood. But the calmness of her mind was soon interrupted by the sound of the overhead PA system crackling to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grace's voice rang out clear and precise, the professional warmth of her tone carrying across the cabin. "We have a special announcement. Please allow me to welcome Ms. Helen Carter, who has kindly accepted an upgrade to first class for the remainder of her flight." Helen's name seemed to hang in the air, and for a split second, it felt as though the entire plane had collectively stopped breathing. The briefest of pauses followed, before the cabin erupted in polite, hesitant applause. The sound was light, more like the polite clapping you'd hear when a child performed their first piano recital, a practiced acknowledgement, but no real warmth behind it. Except for one pair of eyes, Helen felt them on her immediately. Michael. His face was flushed a deep red, the subtle pulse of his neck visible beneath the thin collar of his shirt. His fingers gripped the armrests of his seat, and for a moment, she thought he might crush the plastic. Vanessa, on the other hand, was easier to. Her lips twisted in a tight smile, her eyes narrowing as she looked from Helen to Michael. It was a brief flash of something, disdain, perhaps, but she quickly smothered it, her gaze returning to her husband with a quiet mutter. "She doesn't deserve this," she whispered just loud enough for Helen to hear, the words like ice against her skin. Helen didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge it. This was far from the first time they'd underestimated, far from the first time they thought her dignity could be bought or thrown aside. It wouldn't be the last either. Grace appeared beside her, as if on cue. Her expression was soft, kind, but there was a flicker of something else there, something Helen couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was respect. Perhaps it was pity. "Ms. Carter, if you're ready," Grace said, her voice gentle but firm. There was no room for hesitation in her eyes. Helen stood, moving deliberately but with grace, her hands steady as she tucked her bag under her arm. She felt the eyes of the entire cabin on, the weight of their gaze pressing in, but she didn't care. She'd felt this weight for years. Hadn't it always been there? This was just a new form of it, and she was used to carrying it. As she passed Michael's row, she caught his eye. His jaw tightened, and his lips twisted in a barely concealed sneer. The flush of anger on his face was unmistakable, the red creeping down his neck like a rising tide of shame. He didn't say anything, but his eyes spoke volumes, as though the only thing he could manage to convey was his humiliation. Helen didn't look away. Vanessa, however, couldn't hide her. She didn't even try. Her fingers twitched with impatience as she reached for the drink cart, avoiding Helen's gaze altogether, as if pretending this moment hadn't even happened. Helen moved on, the aisle stretching before her like a path she'd walked many times, though never in such a way. This wasn't about the seat. It was about what she'd endured, what she'd survived, and the strength she'd never allowed them to take from. She had fought for everything she had, every inch of respect, and they could never take that away. As Helen reached the first-class section, she turned briefly to see Emily standing in the aisle, her eyes wide, her face pale. But there was something in her gaze, a quiet, fierce pride that made Helen's chest tighten. Her granddaughter stood there, not as a child who needed protecting, but as someone who had always been by her side, even when no one else was. Helen paused, just for a moment, offering Emily a smile that held more than just gratitude. She wasn't just accepting a seat today, she was accepting her place in this one she'd always had, but had never been allowed to claim till now. Emily stepped forward, her arms opening, and Helen didn't hesitate. She wrapped her arms around her granddaughter in a tight embrace. The weight of everything, of years spent silent, of betrayal, of frustration, melted away for just a moment as Emily, "I'm so proud of you, Grandma." Helen didn't reply, just hugged her a little tighter before pulling away, a single tear slipping down her cheek despite her. "I'm proud of you too," she whispered back. Turning, she moved into her new seat, slipping into it as if she'd been born for it. The soft leather cradled her, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to sink into the luxury. And then, as she settled in, she looked toward the back of the plane one last time. Michael's face was still red, his frustration impossible to hide. Vanessa's eyes were now locked onto her with a gaze that could cut through steel. Helen leaned back, her lips curving into the smallest of smiles as she whispered just loud enough for herself to hear, "Respect doesn't board last." She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The flight attendant's voice echoed over the intercom, but this time, it wasn't an announcement, it was a reminder. A reminder that the world had a way of turning when you least expected it, and Helen was just getting started. The soft murmur of LAX's terminal buzzed around Helen as she sat alone at a small cafe table near the window. The air was heavy with the scent of coffee and distant chatter, the kind of noise that blurred everything and made it easier to. She had just disembarked from the flight, her steps slow and deliberate as she walked through the airport, now with an unusual sense of space surrounding her. Her body still tingled from the tension of the flight, from the looks cast her way, and the unspoken judgments she had endured. But for now, she had escaped. The sound of heels clicking against the polished floor broke the quiet rhythm of her thoughts. Helen turned her head, her breath catching slightly when she saw Grace approaching. The flight attendant looked slightly out of place in the bright, bustling airport, her professional uniform now softened by the casual energy of the space. Grace smiled faintly as she slid into the seat across from Helen. "Didn't expect to see you again so," Helen said, her voice low but steady. There was a slight edge of curiosity, a question she hadn't yet asked, but was growing more eager to know. Grace's smile faded into something more. She glanced around the cafe, her eyes flicking between the crowd and Helen, before leaning in closer. "I'm glad I caught you before you left," she said quietly. "I don't want you to think I'm prying, but there's something I need to." Helen tilted her head slightly, her heart picking up its pace. The look in Grace's eyes wasn't one of casual concern. It was something more. Something she couldn't ignore. "The airline," Grace hesitated, then continued. "We received a fraud alert with your name on it. I didn't want to say anything on the plane, but it was tied to your credit card." Helen felt the words hit her like a sudden gust of. Her breath faltered for just a second. Fraud. Her mind immediately flashed back to the day she had received that unexpected statement from the bank. The confusion, the small but persistent sense that something was off. She had never suspected Michael would stoop so low, but now, in the quiet of the cafe, it felt like the pieces were starting to fall in. "My son?" Helen asked, her voice barely above a, though the weight behind the question was unmistakable. The thought, the possibility, was surreal. Grace didn't respond. She only nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, the credit card is linked to your son's account. There are purchases, big ones, a few flights, expensive hotels, tickets, things you wouldn't have bought. It looks like someone's been using your information to cover their own expenses." Her eyes flicked to the side, careful to avoid meeting Helen's gaze directly. "It's all linked to him." Helen sat back in her chair, a tight knot of disbelief slowly unraveling in her chest. Of course it would be. His reckless nature, his obsession with appearances. She'd known something was wrong, something that hadn't been right for a long time. But this was a betrayal beyond anything she could have imagined. She drew in a slow breath, steadying herself. She had fought for dignity before, had faced down insults and outright cruelty from her family. But this was different. This was something she could not ignore. "Is there anything I can do?" Helen asked, her voice quieter now, the weight of her next words heavy in the air between. "What happens next?" Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table toward Helen. "This is Detective Alan Reeves," she said softly. "He's with financial crime. You need to call him. He'll know what to do next. This is bigger than just credit card fraud. He'll help you take it from here." Helen's fingers wrapped around the card, the name written on it somehow heavier in itself. "Thank you," she said simply, her eyes locking with Grace's. She felt a strange mix of gratitude and frustration swirl within. Grace hadn't had to help, hadn't had to involve her in this tangled mess, but somehow she had. Grace smiled, but there was something distant in. "I just couldn't let you go on without," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I thought you had a right to know." Helen nodded slowly, her eyes moving down to the card in her hand as a deep, quiet anger began to rise inside her. He stole more than comfort, she thought, her voice tightening as she whispered under her breath. "He stole my life." Grace didn't say anything, but Helen could see the sympathy in her eyes, a look she'd grown too used to over the years. But now it didn't matter. She wasn't the victim. Michael had crossed a line, one that could not be uncrossed, and Helen knew she was done letting him control the narrative of her life. As Grace stood to leave, Helen watched her walk away, her mind already turning over the next steps. Her heart was heavy, but there was something else there now, too. Something like clarity. She wasn't just going to let Michael walk away from this, she would fight for everything. Her phone buzzed, snapping her back to the present. A message from Emily. "Are you okay, Grandma?" Helen smiled softly at her heart swelling with pride. She was okay, stronger than she'd ever been. Her fight had only just begun, and she was ready. Helen sat alone in her living room, the phone pressed to her ear, listening to the sharp, methodical voice of Detective Alan Reeves as he laid out the details of the fraud. It was far worse than she had expected, far more calculated than anything she could have imagined. "Your son," Detective Reeves was saying, his voice steady but somber, "has been using your name for more than just the airline tickets and flights. There are loans, too. Multiple loans in your name, secured with your information. These aren't small amounts. We're talking thousands of dollars, all charged to credit cards linked to your account." Helen felt the blood drain from her face. The world around her seemed to blur, as if the words he spoke were too heavy for her to fully process. Michael had always been reckless with money, sure. But this was deliberate. She sat back in the chair, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the "And what happens now?" she asked, her voice low, trying to steady the tremor that threatened to betray her. She couldn't let herself break. "Not now. I'm going to send over the document." We've linked the purchases, the loans, the flights. All of it points back to him. He was listed as an authorized user." His words were clear, his tone one of quiet assurance, but it did nothing to calm the fire that was now burning within her son. The thought curled like smoke in her chest, suffocating. How had it come to this? To the point where he had stolen from her, not just her comfort, but her security, her trust. The betrayal was suffocating, but she couldn't let it show. Not yet. She closed her eyes, drawing a deep breath as her mind processed the new weight of the situation. She'd always known Michael was irresponsible, that his reckless spending had her a ticking but to do this? To ruin her financially? To manipulate her name in such a cold, calculated way? "Mizina Carter," Reeves said, breaking her thoughts. "You don't need to deal with this alone. We have the evidence now, but you'll need legal help. I've already recommended an attorney." "Who?" Helen asked, her voice quieter now, barely above a whisper. She had no idea where to begin. Where could she even start with this? "Rachel Stein," he replied. "She specializes in cases like this: fraud, inheritance disputes, elder abuse. She's tough, and she'll know how to navigate this legally. I'll have her contact you." Helen nodded, even though she knew Reeves couldn't see. She wasn't sure what she felt more: relief that someone was finally taking the situation serious, or the rising anger in her chest that she had been blind to this for so long. She could feel Emily's concern hovering at the edges of her mind. Her granddaughter had always been by her side, quietly supportive, but the weight of what was happening was beginning to settle on her too. Helen could almost hear the way Emily would say her name, the hesitation in her voice, the fear that would inevitably creep in when she realized how deep this betrayal ran. A knock on the door startled her, snapping her out of her thoughts. She hadn't even heard anyone approach. She opened the door to find Emily standing there, her eyes wide, her brow furrowed with concern. Without a word, Emily stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "How are you doing?" she asked softly, her voice steady but filled with the unspoken worry that had become too familiar. Helen swallowed hard and met her granddaughter's gaze. There were so many things she wanted to say, but the words seemed to her throat. Instead, she simply shook her head, her lips pressing into a tight line. Not well, Em. Not well at all. Emily walked over to the table where she'd been sitting, noticing the papers scattered before her, documents of Reeves, the evidence laid bare. Emily didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She had already seen the way Helen's hands shook, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of it all. I'll help you, Grandma, Emily said softly, pulling out a chair and sitting beside. She reached out, her fingers brushing over the paper, her expression unreadable but resonant. Helen's heart ached at the sight of her granddaughter. Emily had always been, but now, it felt like the roles were beginning to shift. Thank you, Em, Helen whispered, her voice rough. I need you more than ever. Emily squeezed her hand, offering her a small, reassuring smile. We'll get through this, Grandma. We'll make it right. Helen nodded, her chest tight as she watched Emily's determined face. She knew she couldn't do this alone, but with Emily by her side, and with the evidence now staring her down, she could finally fight back. As the silence stretched between them, Helen's eyes fell to the papers. The proof was right there, clear and undeniable. She could feel the anger rising again, the sense of injustice that she had buried for so long. She would make Michael pay for this, not just for the money, but for everything he had taken. She reached for a notebook that sat beside her, flipping it open. With a steady hand, she began writing down everything she had learned, every detail she could remember. The facts, the evidence. She had to document everything. Airlines keep record, so will I, she thought, her hand moving across the page with purpose. Her fight had begun long ago, but now it was different. This time she wasn't just, this time she was fighting to. The courtroom was cold, not just the temperature, but the air itself. The sterile, suffocating quietness that seemed to hang above the proceeding. Helen sat at the witness, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had been prepared for this moment, but now, as the judge's stern gaze swept over the room, it all felt too real. Across from her, Michael sat in a crisp suit, his face a mask of calculated concern. His eyes, though, betrayed him. They flickered between Helen and the judge, his gaze tight with frustration. He had always been good at putting on a show, but Helen could see through it now. The pity, the fake empathy, it was all too obvious. To his right sat Vanessa, her lips pursed as though the very air was beneath. Her icy stare never wavered, even as the courtroom hummed with quiet murmur. She wasn't here to support Michael. She was here to control the narrative, to win. Helen couldn't help but feel a small measure of satisfaction. She had always been underestimated, even by her own family, but now, sitting in this courtroom, with all her cards on the, she could feel the shift, the tide. Judge Marianne Brooks sat at the bench, her expression as sharp as ever, her gray eyes flicking between the attorneys with an air of unimpressed scrutiny. The proceedings had begun, and Michael's petition for guardianship was the centerpiece of it all. Your Honor, Michael's attorney said, rising to his feet, his voice smooth and measured. We are here today to petition for guardianship of Helen, as we believe her mental state has deteriorated significantly. She has become confused, unable to manage her own affairs, and as such, we seek the legal authority to manage her finances and well-being. The words cut through the room like Michael had been setting this up for weeks, even before the fraud had come to light. He'd been laying the groundwork, trying to pay Helen as in it made sense. In his mind, how could a mother be trusted to manage her own affairs if she was confused? After all, Helen's chest tightened. Confused. The word was like a slap, but she kept her face neutral. She wasn't going to let him see the effect his words had on her. Your Honor, Rachel Stein said, standing up, her voice calm but unwavering. We object to this petition. The medical evidence, Helen's own doctors, show that she is of sound mind. I have a letter from Dr. Simmons, stating unequivocally that Mrs. Carter is fully capable of managing her affairs. Furthermore, the actions of Mr. C. Carter suggest a far deeper issue, one that's not about his mother's well-being, but about financial control. Rachel's words were like armor around Helen. She could feel the weight of them settle into her chest, the reassurance of having someone in her corner who understood the battle they were fighting. She wasn't just a frail old woman to be dismissed. She had strength, and Rachel saw it. The judge's attention shifted, her eyes narrowing as Rachel. As for the accusations of confusion, Rachel added, her gaze sharp, we have clear evidence of fraud, evidence that links Michael Carter directly to financial manipulation that have drained his mother's savings and ruined her credit. A ripple of gasp swept through the room. Helen caught her breath, feeling a spark of defiance light in her chest. She was no longer the target of Michael's manipulation. Now, the truth was on the table. Detective Reeves took the stand next, his testimony as straightforward as ever. I investigated the charges against Michael Carter, and I can confirm that fraudulent charges, including loans and travel expenses, were made using Mrs. Carter's identity. Michael Carter is listed as an authorized user on her credit account, and the fraud was deliberate and calculated. Helen watched Michael shift uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers drumming against the table, his jaw clenched so tightly she thought it might break. His once immaculate composure was starting to crack. But the real blow came when Grace Miller, the flight attendant, was called to the stand. She stood tall, her uniform neat and professional, but Helen could see the quiet empathy in her eyes. Grace spoke of the flight, of the moment Helen had been humiliated by Michael and Vanessa's cruelty. She recounted the exact words, and how she had seen Helen's quiet dignity in the face of it. On that flight, Grace said, her voice steady but firm, I overheard Mr. Carter's remarks about his mother. He mocked her, made light of her worth. And when Ms. Carter was offered the upgrade to first class, he became visibly angry. He was embarrassed by her. But Mrs. Carter, she didn't flinch. She held her head high. The room was silent as Grace spoke. Helen's eyes lingered on Michael, whose face had gone ashen. His expression twisted in a mix of embarrassment and rage, but he couldn't escape the truth that Grace had just laid bare. He wasn't here to protect his mother. He was here to control her. Emily stood then, her face set with quiet decision as she moved to the witness. Helen's heart swelled with pride as her granddaughter spoke. My grandmother is not confused. She's strong. She's fought for everything she has, and she's never once given up on herself. She doesn't deserve this. The room softened at Emily's words, her fierce loyalty cutting through the tension like a knife. Helen's chest tightened, a lump forming in her throat. Emily was growing up. She was becoming the woman Helen had always known. The judge looked at the documents, the testimony, and then at Mike. She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. I have seen enough, Judge Brooks said, her voice cool but measured. Mr. Carter, your petition for guardianship is denied. In fact, given the evidence before me, I am flipping this case into a fraud investigation. The court will proceed with charges against you for the financial abuse of your mother. The words hit like a thunderclap. Helen felt the full weight of them settle over her, the years of suffering beginning to release from her shoulders. The hearing was far from over, but the first victory had been won. Helen looked at Michael, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes. She was done being his pawn. The sterile hum of the office was broken only by the clicking of keyboard and the occasional shuffle of papers. Helen sat at a small conference table, her hands resting on the folder in front of her. The walls around her were lined with file cabinets, the air heavy with the scent of paper and ink. Outside the windows, the city of Los Angeles stretched out beneath a sky that had started to gray, as though reflecting the tension. Rachel Stein sat across from, focused on the forensic accountant sitting beside them, a young woman in glasses who had just finished explaining the intricate web of financial transactions. Helen listened intently, her mind piecing together the mess Michael had created. The evidence was damning, each new detail like a hammer, striking one after another. The picture is clearer now, the forensic accountant said, flipping through a set of reports. Michael Carter's debts are significant. There are multiple credit cards maxed out, personal loans taken out without your knowledge, all charged to accounts associated. Helen clenched her jaw. Michael's financial recklessness had always been a problem, but this was something else entirely. He had gone too far. And Vanessa? Rachel asked, her voice cool but sharp, cutting through the tension. The accountant glanced at the next report. There's a pattern of designer purchases in Vanessa Carter's name, but paid through Mrs. Carter's credit. High-end stores, luxury brands, things that were never purchased by Helen. Helen's stomach twisted. Vanessa had always been about appearances, but this was a level of entitlement Helen had never expected. To use her like this, to drain her finances for their own image, it made her blood boil, but she knew better than to let it show. This was a battle she would fight with precision, not emotion. Rachel turned her focus back to Helen. We've been compiling everything, a full timeline of fraud and abuse, complete with the financial data and the proof of what Michael and Vanessa have been doing behind your back. Once we present it, We'll be in a position to pursue criminal charges. We'll also be seeking restitution for you." Helen nodded, her face calm but resolute. She didn't need to hear the detail. She knew what had been done to her. What mattered now was how to make it stop, how to take back control from the people who had tried to strip it away. Across the table, Emily sat, her expression unreadable as she listened to the detail. Helen could see the conflict in her granddaughter's eyes, the loyalty to her family that had always been so strong, now at war with the cold, hard truth. Helen could feel the weight of it in her chest. Emily was young, and this was a lot for her to bear. The realization that her mother and father had done this, that they were capable of such cruelty, it had to be tearing her up. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Emily with her voice tight with him. "I want to believe in them, but this is different. I don't know if I can look." Helen reached across the table and, squeezing it gently. "I know, sweetie," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I never wanted you to see them this way, but sometimes we have to face the truth, no matter how much it hurts." Emily's eyes welled up, but she didn't look away. She was torn. Helen could see, torn between the love she had for her parents and the loyalty she felt toward her grandmother. It would take time for Emily to process it all, but Helen knew she wasn't alone anymore. The girl who had once been her protector was growing into a fierce ally. As the room fell into a tense silence, Detective Reeves entered, his presence commanding as always. He nodded to the group before focusing on Helen. "The DA's office is ready to move forward," he said, his voice firm. "We'll be filing charges soon. We've got the evidence now, and we can't let this go any longer." Helen's heart raced at the finality, and there was no turning back now. Michael and Vanessa had played their hand, and now they would face the consequence. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the betrayal, the years of manipulation, the quiet indignities she had suffered, masked behind smiles and empty promises. She looked at Rachel, then Emily, and finally, Detective. Her voice was calm, but there was a steel to it that hadn't been there before. "He thought turbulence was temporary," Helen said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But it's permanent now. We're not just fighting for my money. We're fighting for my life." A silence fell over the room. Helen's words hung heavy in the air. She had never been one to back down, but now she felt something different. This wasn't just a battle over finance. It was about taking back her dignity. It was about proving that no one, not even her own blood, could take that away from her. Detective Reeves gave a small nod of approval. "That's exactly the mindset we need." Helen stood, her back straight, a quiet resolve settling over her. She wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. The storm had already come, and she had weathered it. Now, she was ready to make sure that Michael and Vanessa paid for every moment of it. As she walked out of the office, Emily by her side, Helen could feel the weight of what was ahead. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. They had crossed a line, and now it was her turn. The fight was far from, but Helen had already won the first battle, and that was enough to make her believe she could win the war. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of Helen's living room, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. She was sitting at the kitchen table, the familiar hum of her old clock ticking softly in the background. She'd always found comfort in the simplicity of home, but today the silence felt oppressive, like a storm was brewing. There was a knock at the door. Helen's heart stuttered in her chest. She knew who it was before she even stood to answer. Michael. She took a deep breath and stood, her back straight. The faintest trace of hesitation flitted through her mind, but she pushed it down. This was not about fear anymore. This was about reclaiming what was hers, her peace, her dignity, her life. When she opened the door, Michael stood there, his face flushed with anger. He had always been able to manipulate situations, to twist them to his favor, but now, there was something different in his eyes, something darker. "Mom," he spat, the word a sneer on his. "You'll regret this, all of it, every last bit of it." Helen didn't. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. "You're wrong, Mike," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "This isn't about regret. This is about you facing the consequences of your action." He stepped forward, his face contorting with fury. "Consequences?" he yelled, his voice rising. "You think you're going to ruin me over some damn money? Over nothing? You're nothing but a confused old woman who doesn't know what she's doing." Helen's chest tightened, but she didn't let his words reach her. She had heard them before, too many times. The subtle insult, the attempts to undermine her, to make her doubt herself. But she wasn't going to fall for it this time. "I'm not confused, Michael," she said, each word crisp and deliberate, "and you know it. You're just angry because you've been caught." His face flushed red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I should have known you'd turn on me. You think I'll let you get away with this? You will regret this, Mom. You and your little lawyer, he sneered, glancing toward the table where Rachel's card sat. You're going to ruin your own family. All for nothing. As his words hit the air, the sound of a phone's camera clicking sharply broke through the tension. Michael froze, his eyes darting to the side. Emily stood by the hallway, her phone raised, the camera rolling. She was silent, her face hard, but the determination in her eyes was unmistakable. You want to threaten her? Emily said, her voice cold as ice. Do you really think that's going to work? You're going to regret this. Michael's eyes widened as he realized Emily had been recording. For a moment, it seemed like he might snap. His face twisted in rage and he took a step toward her, but Helen was quicker. Don't even think about it, she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. She moved in front of Emily, shielding her from Michael. You've made your threats, and now, we have proof. Michael's face darkened, his eyes flashing with pure venom. You're making a big mistake, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You don't know who you're messing with. Helen stood her ground, her heart steady, her pulse calm. She had nothing to fear anymore. The only mistake I made was letting you take so much from me, she said, her voice a quiet fury. At that moment, Detective Reeves entered the room, his presence a solid wall between Michael and the rest of them. He took one look at Michael and didn't even flinch. Everything's being recorded, Mr. Carter, Reeves said, his voice firm. Your threats will be added to the case, and I'll be showing this video to the DA. Michael's chest heaved with anger, but he said nothing. He was trapped now, caught in a web of his own making. Rachel Stein's voice came from behind Helen, cool and professional. We're filing for a restraining order today, Michael. You won't be able to come near her again, not without facing legal consequences. Michael opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. The magnitude of what was happening seemed to settle on, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He had pushed too far, and now, there was no way back. Vanessa, who had been standing silently, her eyes flicking between Michael and Helen, shifted uncomfortably. The sharpness in her expression faltered for the first time, as though the certainty she had once held was beginning to crumble. Helen noticed. She didn't need to say anything. Vanessa had always been the calculator, the manipulator, but now she was watching the walls close in on her. The cracks were starting to show. Helen turned her gaze back to Michael. His anger was still simmering beneath the surface, but there was a new fear in his eyes. It was the fear of losing control. Helen took a slow breath, the calmness in her voice cutting through the chaos. Every word you've spoken today is evidence. It's all part of the case now. You've crossed a line, Michael, and there's no going back. For a moment, Michael stood there, seething, his fists clenched at his sides. But then, with a final glare, he turned and stormed out of the house, the door slamming behind him. Helen exhaled slowly, the weight of it all crashing down. The fight wasn't over, but this was a turning point. Michael had just made the worst mistake of his life. She turned to Emily, who stood by her side, her phone You did the right thing, Helen said softly. Emily nodded, her eyes meeting Helen with a quiet strength. I'll always protect you, no matter what. And in that moment, Helen, no matter what came, she would never face it alone. The morning light streamed through the window of Helen's living room, but it didn't feel as warm as it once. The world outside seemed to be moving at its usual, but inside, everything had changed. The weight of the storm that had begun brewing with Michael's betrayal had already begun to shift. Now, it was fully on display, and the public was taking notice. Helen sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea in front of her that she had forgotten about. Her eyes were locked onto the newspaper spread out before her. The headline screamed in bold letters, "Elder abuse allegations rock prominent local family, financial exploitation exposed." The words felt surreal, a world she had never thought she'd see her name, but there it was. A story that was both too personal and too public to ignore. The article laid out the facts. Michael Carter, her son, and his wife Vanessa had been exploiting Helen's finances for months, using her credit, racking up loans, and making luxury purchases, all while pretending to care for her well-being. It wasn't just a financial crime, it was a deep violation of trust. And now, it was in the open, for everyone to see. Helen's phone buzzed on the table and she reached, her fingers stiff. There were messages from neighbors, friends, and distant relatives. The first one was from Martha, her neighbor. "We're all behind you, Helen. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. You're not alone." Helen smiled softly, her heart warmed by the unexpected outpouring of support. Across the street, Mrs. Jenkins had left a voicemail asking if she could bring over dinner. It was the kind of small-town solidarity that she had never really appreciated until now, when it was offered without reservation. Her strength didn't have to come from a place of solitude. She wasn't just an old woman fighting to get by. She was a symbol of resistance. Her smile faltered slightly as her eyes drifted back to the newspaper. She imagined Michael reading these words, his fury bubbling over as he realized just how far his reputation had fallen. His name, once polished and perfect in the public eye, was now tarnished. The article painted him as a villain, a predator, and that was something he would never be able to. Michael was furious, of course. She had expected nothing less. Helen could already see him pacing in his luxury home, gritting his fuming over how quickly things had spiraled out of his control. The world, which he had so carefully curated for his image, was crumbling in front of him. Rachel Stein's voice echoed in her memory, cool and calculated, when they had first discussed the media's involvement. Public shame is leverage, she had said, her tone devoid of any hint of remorse. This case isn't just about money, and it's about exposing the truth, no matter how messy it gets. Rachel had been right. There was something satisfying in seeing the truth laid bare. Helen had been a victim for so long, hidden in the shadows of their manipulation, but now the spotlight was on them. There was no escaping it, and Helen, for the first time, felt like she was in control. As if on cue, Detective Reeves called. His voice was direct. No nonsense, as always. The DA's office is ready to move forward. We have the evidence and we're pushing ahead with criminal charges. The media coverage is only helping our... Helen nodded silently, her fingers running over the edge of her teacup. She had known that this would be the hard part, the part where the world would look at her and judge her. But as she sat in her own living room, reading about her own life, she realized that the world wasn't looking at her as a victim. They were looking at her as a fighter. She placed the cup down and looked out the window. The trees swayed in the world outside still busy, oblivious to the storm that had raged in her life just days ago. The cabin lights are on now, Helen whispered to herself, repeating the words she had once heard from the flight attendant. The memory of that moment, the upgrade, the humiliation, the dignity she had reclaimed, was still fresh in her. She had stepped into that first-class seat as a silent victory, knowing the real battle had just begun. The cabin light, like the spotlight on her life, were now shining brightly. And Michael? He was still in the dark. Rachel's words rang in her ears once more. Public shame is leverage. Helen knew now that every bit of leverage she had was the truth. And truth, once exposed, couldn't be hidden. She wasn't just fighting for her money or her life anymore. She was fighting for the integrity that Michael had tried to strip away. And with every passing day, with every new headline, she could feel the walls closing in on him. For the first time in years, Helen felt a surge of hope. This time, she wasn't just surviving, she was winning. And the war was far from over. The courtroom was eerily quiet, the silence almost deafening as the grand jury deliberated behind closed doors. Helen sat alone in a small waiting area, her hands folded on her lap, her back straight, her eyes focused on the folder in front of her. The weight of what was about to happen pressed heavily on her chest, but she remained calm. She had learned long ago that patience was its own kind of power. Rachel Stein sat across from her, reviewing notes on her tablet, her expression focused but not tense. The atmosphere between them had shifted. What had started as a legal battle was now something more personal. Rachel had become more than just an attorney. She had become an ally, someone who understood the depth of what Helen had suffered, someone who could feel the gravity of each step forward. Rachel looked up from her notes, meeting Helen's eyes. "It's happening, Helen. Michael's going down for this. The evidence is too strong." Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet confidence. Helen nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had spent years silenced by her son's manipulation, by the quiet coercion of his action. Now, the truth was coming to light in ways that couldn't be ignored. But the fight wasn't. Not yet. There was still so much left to face. Detective Reeves entered the room, his usual stoic demeanor giving way to a subtle, approving smile. "Grand juries made their decision," he said, the words echoing through the room. "Michael has been indicted on charges of identity theft and fraud. We've got him." Helen felt the weight of his words settle on, the relief slow to... This was just the beginning of the legal process, but it was a victory nonetheless. A victory that had taken far too long to come. Rachel sat up straighter, a faint smile crossing her lips. Vanessa's also implicated. The spending was traced back to her too. The designer purchases, the luxury goods. We've got everything we need. Helen's eyes flicked to the window, the sunlight falling in soft beams across the floor. Vanessa's involvement had always been there, lurking in the background. But now it was undeniable. The truth had caught up to both of them. Michael and Vanessa had tried to spin their own narrative. But this was the truth they couldn't escape. I want everything, Helen whispered, her voice steady but firm. Restitution. I want it all back. Every penny. And I want them to understand the cost of what they did. To me, to my life. Rachel nodded, her fingers tapping the screen of her tablet as she started compiling the necessary. We'll file for restitution right away. The evidence is solid. The DA will back us. They'll be held accountable for every bit of it. Helen felt a flicker of something inside her. Anger, but also something deeper. Something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for so long. Justice. But then, the room grew silent again. Emily stepped in, her face serious but proud, her posture strong as she moved to sit next to Helen. The young woman was already becoming the person Helen had hoped she would be. Brave, unwavering, and fiercely. How's everything going? Emily asked, her voice quiet but full of determination. Michael's been indicted, Helen said, the words settling in her chest with a calm finality. And Vanessa's being implicated too. They won't get away with it, not this time. Emily smiled, but there was an underlying sadness in her eyes. She had always wanted to protect her family, her parents, her home. But now, the truth had forced her to face the uncomfortable reality of what had been happening. It wasn't just a betrayal of Helen, it was a betrayal of Emily's trust, too. Emily nodded. I'm proud of you, Grandma. You're not alone. I'll be with you every step of the way. As they spoke, the door to the waiting room opened, and Grace Miller stepped in, her professional demeanor still holding with a touch of warmth in her eyes. I've got the written statement from my end, she said, handing over a sealed envelope. I'll testify to everything I saw. On the plane, the way Michael and Vanessa treated you, the fraud, all of it. The DA's ready to bring the case forward. We've got them cornered. Helen took the envelope, her fingers brushing against the paper, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to take in the strength of this moment. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. There were people who believed in her, who were willing to stand by her when it mattered most. And they were going to make sure that Michael and Vanessa faced the consequence of their action. Just as the weight of that realization began to settle in, the door opened again. Detective Reeves stepped inside, his expression serious but optimistic. The DA's ready to move forward. We're bringing the case to court next. We've got all the pieces in place. Helen looked at the group gathered around her. Rachel, Emily, Grace, Detective Reeves. For the first time in years, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. The storm had come, but now it was time to turn it around. This wasn't just about her money or her life. It was about her dignity, her voice. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, for believing in me. Rachel's gaze softened. You didn't have to ask. We've always known you had the strength to fight. Now, the world will know. Helen stood, her feet planted firmly on the ground. She wasn't just surviving she was ready to win. And this time, the courtroom was filled with the quiet buzz of anticipation. The trial began. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators, journalists, and the few brave souls who had come to watch the unfolding drama. It felt surreal to Helen, sitting there, her back straight and her hands folded neatly on her lap. She had never imagined she'd find herself in a place like this, her life turned into a public spectacle. Yet, here she was, at the center of a case that would change everything. Michael sat across the room, his usual air of confidence replaced with a barely contained fury. He was no longer the man who had controlled every conversation, every move. Now he was the one in the spotlight, his actions dissected by lawyers, judges, and a jury of strangers. Vanessa sat beside him, her face tight with a mixture of disdain and nervousness. The high-end clothes that had once been a symbol of their success now seemed out of place, tacky, even, against the cold reality of the trial. The judge, a woman with sharp, calculating eyes, called the court to order. We are here today, she began, to determine the guilt or innocence of Michael Carter in the matter of fraud, identity theft, and elder exploitation. Let the evidence speak for itself. Helen could feel the weight of those words sink deep into her. Elder exploitation. It was a term she never thought she would hear in relation to her life. But now, the truth was undeniable. Michael had stolen more than her money. He had stolen her dignity, her trust, her place in the family. And today, she would make sure he would pay for it. The trial began with Michael's lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, standing up and addressing the jury. His voice was smooth, practiced, his words dripping with manipulation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, turning to face the group. "My client, Michael Carter, is a man of integrity. What has been painted as exploitation is nothing more than a misunderstanding. My client's mother, Helen Carter, has been confused for some time. Her memory is faltering, and she was unable to manage her own affairs. This entire case is an unfortunate result of her confusion, and the actions that have been labeled as fraud were simply him trying to take care of her." Helen felt her chest tighten at his words. It was the same thing Michael had been saying all along, that she was confused, incapable, helpless. She had been painted as the old woman who couldn't manage her own life. But the truth was, she had been deceived. And now, it was time for that to be known. Rachel Stein stood then, poised and calm as she addressed the jury. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she said, her voice unwavering. "The defense would like to paint a picture of a confused woman who was taken advantage of by her own son. But the truth is this: Helen Carter is not confused. The only one who was confused here was Michael, who thought he could get away with exploiting his mother for his own benefit." Rachel's words were like a sharp knife cutting through the air, and Helen felt a surge of pride. This was the moment she had waited for, the moment where the truth would be known, and Michael's lies would unravel. The defense lawyer sputtered but was cut off by the judge, who gestured for Rachel to. Rachel laid out the evidence methodically. "We have financial records showing Michael Carter's abuse of his mother's credit. We have proof of the loans he took out in her name, and we have documented evidence of Vanessa's involvement in the luxury purchases made using Helen's finances." Helen could feel the eyes of the jury on her, but she remained calm, steady. This wasn't about the money. It was about taking back her life, her dignity, and her voice. Next, Detective Reeves was called to the stand. He gave a measured, professional account of the fraud investigation. His testimony was simple, but damning. "We found multiple fraudulent charges made to Helen Carter's accounts," he said, his eyes steady as he faced the jury. "These charges were linked directly to Michael Carter's spending habit. There was no mistake. This was deliberate." Michael's face reddened as Reeves spoke, his body tensing with each passing word. Helen could see the cracks starting to form in his carefully constructed facade. Then, the moment Helen had been waiting for arrived. Emily stood up to testify. Her presence was strong, her gaze unflinching as she made her way to the witness stand. As Emily began speaking, her voice strong but full of emotion, Helen could feel the walls of the courtroom tighten. "I've seen it," Emily said, her voice clear. "I've seen the way my parents treated my grandmother, the way they used her. They don't care about her. They only care about themselves." Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She held it up for the jury to see. "I recorded a conversation," she said, her voice steady as the recording played over the courtroom speakers. Michael's angry voice rang out, threatening, "You'll regret this. You have no idea what you've done." The room fell into silence as the recording ended. The jury's eyes flicked to Michael, who was now visibly shaking with rage. His face had lost all color, and his lawyer quickly rose to object, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Helen sat silently, dignified in her resolve. She wasn't confused, she wasn't helpless, and for the first time, the truth was finally being heard. And then, the twist came. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the judge said, her voice cool and deliberate, "this case has shifted in light of the evidence presented today. We will not just be addressing financial fraud. We are now considering the precedent-setting implications of elder exploitation." The words hit like a thunderclap. The case had shifted, and suddenly, this wasn't just about Michael anymore. This was about setting a precedent that would change everything. Helen took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving Michael. The battle had just escalated and she was ready. The fight wasn't over yet, but she was no longer just surviving. Now, she was making him. The night felt too long, the minutes dragging on as though time itself had decided to withhold the answers Helen had waited years for. The jury had deliberated, and now they were out. The court had recessed for the evening, but Helen couldn't shake the weight of the moment. She sat at her kitchen table, the binder of evidence in her lap, her fingers tracing the edge of the worn leather. It felt like she had lived a lifetime in the last. But now, the end of this chapter. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. The familiar sounds of her home were all there, but they felt distant, muted. Emily had gone upstairs to her room, though Helen could hear her moving about. Her granddaughter had been quiet today, more so than usual, and it worried Helen. She could feel the undercurrent of anxiety between the knowledge that the next day would change everything. Helen glanced toward the window. The sky outside had darkened to a deep navy, stars flickering in the distance, each one too far to tell. How many times had she looked at the stars in her, never imagining that one day she would be sitting here, waiting for a verdict on her life. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Emily standing at the threshold of the kitchen, her posture stiff with nerves, but her eyes warm with support. "Grandma, are you okay?" Emily asked softly. Helen smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, just waiting." Emily nodded, but Helen could see the tightness in her shoulders, the way her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. "I'm scared, Grandma. What if it doesn't go the way we hope? What if they don't believe you?" Helen's heart squeezed at the sight of her granddaughter so vulnerable, but she knew Emily wasn't alone. She had been by her side this entire time, fighting the same fight, even if she couldn't fully understand the depth of it. "You've been amazing," Helen said, her voice steady. "What happens tomorrow doesn't change what's already been done. We've already shown the world who they really are. No matter what the jury decides, I've already won." Emily sat down beside her, and for a moment, they simply shared the quiet, the weight of everything suspended in the air between. The trial had felt like a blur, but now, in the stillness of the night, Helen realized just how much she had finally found her voice, and Emily had found hers too. There was a knock at the door, and Helen's gaze shifted toward it. She wasn't expecting it, but when the door opened, Martha, her neighbor, stepped inside, holding a warm casserole dish in her. "Thought you might need a little comfort food," Martha said with a gentle smile, setting the dish down on the. She wasn't just a neighbor to Helen, she was someone who had watched over her in the quiet moments, someone who had shown up without question, even when the world seemed too heavy. Helen smiled gratefully as Martha sat down across from her. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've got this, Helen," Martha said, her voice low but confident. "You're not in this alone. Everyone around here is rooting for you. We're all behind you." Helen nodded, her chest tightening with a mixture of gratitude and the lingering fear of what was to come. She had thought that this fight was just about her family, but now, as she sat surrounded by the people who believed in her, she realized how much larger it was about something bigger than her personal. It was about justice, about setting a precedent that couldn't be ignored. "I'm proud of you," Martha added, reaching over to squeeze Helen's hand. Rachel's voice cut through the quiet as she entered the. "Helen," she said softly, offering a reassuring smile. "The jury is deliberating carefully. They won't rush their decision. They know the weight of what they're deciding." Helen gave a small, thankful nod. Rachel had been her rock through it all, her calm and steady presence. "I trust them," Helen replied quietly. "And I trust you." Rachel took a seat, the three of them in the small circle that had formed. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. All the years of struggle, all the betrayals, and now this one final step toward closure. As the night drew on, Emily eventually excused herself and retreated to bed, but not before hugging Helen tightly, the two of them sharing a quiet moment of reassurance. Helen kissed her forehead and watched as Emily disappeared upstairs. Helen sat by the window, watching the moonlight reflect off the trees outside. Her mind wandered to the past, to all the moments she had let herself shrink under the weight of others' expectations. Not anymore. This was her moment. With a soft sigh, Helen closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, her voice low but filled with purpose. "Give me the strength to carry this through, no matter the outcome." The hours stretched on, but when the phone finally rang, it felt like a lifetime had passed. Helen picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly. "Ms. Carter?" It was the voice of the court clerk. "The verdict is ready." The moment had arrived. Helen's breath caught in her throat as she looked out the window, the weight of the call hanging in the air, and her heart pounding louder than ever before. The courtroom felt different today, heavier, more electric, as though the very air hummed with the anticipation of the final moment. Helen sat in her hands folded, her back. The quiet buzz of the room surrounded her, but she barely noticed it. All her focus was on the judge, her eyes locked on the woman who would soon determine whether the years of betrayal would finally come to an end. The jury had returned. After all the deliberations, all the testimony, it was now time for the verdict. It had been hours, but for Helen, it felt like an. Michael had been found guilty of identity theft, fraud, and elder exploitation. But what would the consequences be? Would he finally face the consequences of his actions? And Vanessa, his silent accomplice, what would be her fate? The judge stood, and the room went silent. Helen could hear her own breath in the stillness, the pounding of her heart in her chest. Michael Carter, the judge began, her voice calm, unshaken. On the charges of identity theft, fraud, and elder exploitation, this jury has found you guilty. The evidence against you was overwhelming, and your actions were deliberate. Helen's chest tightened. The words she had longed to hear were finally. Michael was guilty. He would finally face the consequences of what he had done to her. And as for Vanessa Carter, the judge can. You were complicit in the fraudulent transaction. Though you did not act alone, you are guilty of aiding and abetting in this exploitation. However, given your level of involvement, the court will issue a sentence of probation with mandatory counseling and restitution. Helen's fingers tightened around the edge of her. It wasn't the harsh punishment she had hoped for, but it was something. Vanessa's reign of manipulation was over, and at least that gave her some satisfaction. Her involvement, though not as visible as Michael's, had been just as destructive. And finally, the judge's voice cut through the room. The court hereby strips Michael Carter of all inheritance rights to Helen Carter's estate. This will stand as a permanent decision. His actions are not to be rewarded. The words echoed in Helen's mind. Michael's inheritance rights stripped. It was the final, undeniable mark of his betrayal. He had taken so much from her, but now he would take nothing. That inheritance, which had been his entitlement for so long, would no longer be his. Restitution is to be paid in full. The judge continued. All funds obtained through fraudulent means will be returned to Helen Carter, including any property or goods acquired through misrepresentation. Helen allowed herself to exhale, the relief almost too much to bear. She had fought for this. She had fought for her dignity. And now, the courtroom was still, as if everyone was waiting for her reaction. She looked around at the faces, the people who had witnessed her fight. Rachel sat beside her, her expression calm but satisfied. Emily, her granddaughter, sat next to Rachel, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes wide with both pride and. Helen felt the tears well up, but she held them back, her lips pressing into a tight line. She wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. The fight had been long, and it had been hard, but this was her moment of victory. This was her justice. When the judge dismissed the court, the room slowly began to empty, but Helen remained seated taking in the weight of what had just happened. The years of doubt, the silent suffering, all of it had led her to this. The courtroom door swung open, and Emily was the first to stand, rushing toward her grandmother with arms open wide. "I'm so proud of you, Grandma," Emily whispered, her voice breaking as she wrapped Helen in a fierce embrace. Helen held her tight, a lump forming in her throat. She had always protected Emily, always tried to shield her from the cruelties of the world. But in this moment, Emily had become she had stood by her, unwavering, even when the truth was too painful to face. Helen pulled back, her eyes meeting her granddaughter. "We did it, Em," she said softly. "We did it." Rachel stepped forward, her eyes soft but full of strength. "Congratulations, Helen," she said. "This victory will set a precedent for elder exploitation cases everywhere." Helen nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She was starting to believe it now. She hadn't just won for herself. She had won for every elder who had ever been exploited, for every person who had been silenced and dismissed. This wasn't just about money. This was about the integrity that they had tried to strip away. Helen pulled her phone from her bag, her fingers shaking slightly as she checked the notification. One stood out among the rest. An email from Grace Miller, the flight attendant who had stood by her from the very beginning. "Congratulations, you've changed everything. We're all so proud of you. The world is watching now. And it's time for them to hear your voice." Helen whispered a quiet thanks as she closed her phone. It wasn't over. Not yet. But the storm had passed. She had taken back what was hers. And as the weight of the last few months lifted, Helen's, the victory, comfort, she whispered. The follow-up hearing was a blur of formality, the air in the courtroom thick with the guilty verdicts for Michael and Vanessa had already been handed down. But this next chapter, this final act, was about sealing the fate of their exploit and setting a precedent for future cases of elder. Helen sat in the same seat, her fingers still clutching the edge of her seat, but this time there was a lightness to her. The tension that had gripped her heart for so long was now replaced with a quiet strength, a sense of justice finally being served. Rachel Stein, ever composed, sat beside her, reviewing her notes. Emily, her granddaughter, was nearby, her eyes filled with pride, her hand resting on Helen. It was Grace Miller, the flight attendant, who would be called to the stand. She had been the first person to witness the public humiliation that had sparked the entire chain of events, the moment when Michael had ordered Helen to the back of the plane, sneering at her like she was nothing. But it was Grace's testimony that had made everything real, brought the whole case to life. "Ms. Miller," the judge began, her voice steady and commanding, "please describe the events of that flight, particularly the interaction between Michael Carter and his mother." Grace stood tall, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of something more, something personal. She had seen Helen's pain, had witnessed the cruelty firsthand. She wasn't just a witness now, she was an advocate, a symbol of support. "I was the flight attendant on that flight," Grace began, her voice calm but firm. "I overheard Mr. Carter's comments to his mother as she was boarding. He spoke to her with disdain, mocking her in front of the other passengers. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he treated her, the way he made her feel small, insignificant. When I heard him say, 'Switch her to economy, she's not worth coming,' it broke my heart. He humiliated her." Helen's chest tightened at the memory, but she remained composed, her eyes fixed on Grace, giving her the silent support she needed to continue. The courtroom was dead silent, each word Grace spoke hanging heavily in the air. Grace continued, her gaze unwavering. "I offered Ms. Carter an upgrade to first class to avoid further embarrassment. When she took her seat, I noticed a shift in the room. The passengers applauded, but Mr. Carter, his face turned crimson. It was as though he couldn't stand the idea of his mother being treated with respect. But Helen, she held her head high. She didn't let his cruelty break her." The judge's expression darkened as she listened, her eyes flicking to Michael, whose discomfort was palpable. He shifted in his seat, the shame creeping over him like a shadow he couldn't escape. His attempt to control the situation, his mother, his family, had been exposed for the world to see. "And did this moment, this humiliation," the judge asked, her voice sharp, "have any lasting impact on Mrs. Carter?" Grace hesitated for only a moment before answering, her voice thick with empathy. "Yes, it wasn't just the seat, it was everything. It was the years of her being treated as an afterthought, as someone whose worth was diminished. That moment on the plane, it was the culmination of years of mistreatment." The room seemed to breathe as Grace's words settled over everyone. The depth of Michael's cruelty, the way he had used his mother for years, the way he had torn at her dignity, none of it could be hidden anymore. And now, in this courtroom, the truth was being laid bare, piece by painful piece. The judge's next words sent a ripple through the room. "The flight incident," she began, "is not just an isolated case of disrespect. It is a manifestation of a pattern of behavior that Michael Carter has used to exploit his mother. I find this moment to be a significant piece of evidence in the larger scope of this case." The public gasped, and Helen could feel the eyes of the courtroom turn to her. The insult she had suffered on the plane, the public degradation, was now a symbol of the systemic exploitation she had faced. Rachel, sitting beside Helen, smiled subtly, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. She had known from the beginning that this moment, the seat switch, would be the key to unlocking the true gravity of Michael's action. The court had now taken that symbolic moment and used it to solidify The judge's next words rang out with finality. "The actions of Michael Carter, from the fraudulent activities to the exploitation of his mother in public and private, will set a legal precedent in elder abuse cases. His behavior will not be tolerated, and the severity of his actions will reflect in this court's judgment." Helen sat still, her eyes never leaving Michael. His face was a mixture of humiliation and rage, but in that moment, Helen knew. She had taken back everything he had tried to strip from her, not just her money, but her dignity, her voice. The judge turned to Helen, her expression softer. "Mrs. Carter, you've shown immense courage in this, and the court commends you for your bravery." Helen didn't respond to me. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced by cruelty, by betrayal. As the room began to empty, and the case concluded, Rachel leaned over, her voice low. "He erased comfort, but you erased his control." Helen nodded, her lips curving into a quiet. She had taken back more than just, she had reclaimed her life. And as she walked out of the courtroom, Emily by her side, Helen knew that no matter what the future held, nothing could ever strip her of the strength she had found within herself. The world had finally seen her truth. And now, the storm was over. The quiet of the house felt almost like a different world compared to the storm of the past. The courtroom drama had concluded, but it still seemed surreal to Helen that she had secured her dignity, her life back, but the peace that followed was still unfamiliar, still something she was learning to embrace. Helen sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her, as she glanced at the small, heavy binder that held all the evidence, all the paperwork. It had been locked away in the safe for a few days now, but its weight was still there, proof of everything she had endured and overcome. Every page had been a reminder of the battle she'd fought, and now it was sealed, contained. The evidence was no longer needed. The battle was over. Emily sat beside her, a notebook open in front of her, studying quietly. She had always been the bright, protective granddaughter, and now she was preparing for her own. Helen watched her, the steady hum of her granddaughter's pen across the page, providing a sense of calm after the chaos of the trial. There were still days when the weight of everything hung in the air between them, but this was one of the moments where it felt like the world was right. Their lives weren't defined by the past. And how's the studying going? Helen asked, breaking the silence, though her voice was soft, more out of affection than curiosity. Emily looked up from her book, her eyes warm, a small smile on her. It's good, Grandma. Just focusing on the basics for now. You know, getting ahead for next year. Helen smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Emily had always been the kind of girl who didn't back down from a challenge, and now that strength was more than just a protective. It was a part of her, like it was in Helen. The years they'd spent together, the quiet moments and struggles, had shaped them both in ways they would never have imagined. The doorbell rang, interrupting the stillness. Helen stood slowly, her knees creaking slightly. She wasn't as spry as she used to be, but there was a steadiness in her steps now that hadn't been there. She opened the door to find Rachel Stein standing on the other side, holding a stack of paperwork. Thought I'd stop by with the final papers? Rachel said with a smile, stepping in. Everything's finalized. Michael's restitution payment has been processed, and the legal ramifications are all set. The court has also filed for continued monitoring of his asset, which will ensure he can't manipulate his way out of repaying. Helen took the stack of, feeling the finality in Rachel's. Thank you, she said quietly, but her gratitude ran deeper than words could express. Rachel had been her rock, her calm in the storm, the one who'd given her a fighting chance she thought there was. You did it, Helen, Rachel said, her voice soft with pride. You took back everything that was taken from, and you've set a precedent for others who will come after you. Helen nodded, feeling the weight of that realization settling into her bone. It wasn't just about her anymore. She had done this for everyone who had ever been overlooked, mistreated, manipulated. She had fought for their dignity as much as her own. Before Rachel could leave, the doorbell rang again. This time it was Detective Reeves, holding a folder with a few more documents inside. His usually reserved face had softened, his expression more relaxed than before. The DA has finalized the criminal portion of the case, Reeves explained, handing her the folder. Michael's criminal charges have been filed. Probation for Vanessa. It's all officially over, Helen. You don't need to worry about them. Helen took the folder and looked up at Reeves, her heart swelling with quiet relief. It's over, for good. Reeves smiled, nodding. It is. You did more than just win a case. You gave a voice to so many others who never had one. Helen felt a lump form in her throat, but she kept her composure. The weight of everything, the pain, the deceit, was finally lifting. The air in the room felt lighter now, as if it had been cleared of all the resentment, all the bitterness that had clung to for so long. As the two of them left, and Helen closed the door behind them, the house seemed almost too quiet, but it wasn't empty. The stillness was a kind of peace, a peace she hadn't known in years. Helen walked back to the kitchen table, her eyes falling on the binder one last time. She didn't need it any. Not really. She knew what had happened. She knew what she'd fought for. Emily glanced up from her voice tented. Grandma? Helen smiled, turning toward her granddaughter. Yes, sweetie? Emily smiled back, her eyes sparkling with a future that was no longer defined by betrayal. It's done, isn't it? It's really over? Helen nodded, her heart full. Yes, Emily, it's done. As Helen stood by the window, watching the sunset light up the sky with streaks of gold and orange, she whispered the words to herself, a quiet affirmation of everything she had overcome. Dignity doesn't, she murmured, the weight of the past finally settling into something like she had not just survived, she had reclaimed, and that was the greatest victory of all. The stage was set in a grand hall, the lights dimming slightly as Helen stood at the podium. The room buzzed with anticipation, filled with the hum of excited conversation from the audience. Today was the day she would speak to a crowd that not only needed to hear her, but to understand its significance. It was one thing to survive. It was another to stand tall and share that survival with. Helen adjusted the microphone, feeling the cool metal against her fingertips, but she felt a strange calm. This was her moment, and as much as the idea of speaking publicly had once terrified, she now felt a quiet, unshakable strength in the pit of her stomach. The quiet she had once feared had now become a place of power. She had fought for so long in silence, but today, her voice would echo far beyond these walls. She looked down at the papers in front of her, her prepared speech neatly arranged, but she didn't need them anymore. She had lived this story. She had walked this journey. The words she needed to speak were already inside her. She looked up, her eyes scanning the crowd, and saw Rachel and Emily seated together near the front. Emily's face was a mix of pride and quiet excitement, her hand clasped tightly. Helen smiled, her heart swelling. Emily had stood by her side through the darkest, and now, here she was, her granddaughter, strong and steadfast, a reflection of everything Helen had hoped to pass down. She caught Rachel's eye, who gave her a reassuring nod. Rachel had always believed, even when Helen hadn't quite believed in herself. Together, they had shattered the silence that had once kept her. Helen took a breath, the weight of it all settling in her chest, and then I stand before you today, not just as a woman who survived, Helen began, her voice steady, but as a woman who reclaimed her. I was once silenced, humiliated, and made to feel invisible. The people closest, the ones who should have loved and protected, took from me. They stole my peace, my trust, and yes, even my. And for too long, I allowed them to. The room was still. The audience listened intently, many of them leaning forward, some holding their breath, waiting for her next words. But, Helen continued, her voice firm, I learned that no one has the right to take away your dignity, not your family, not anyone. We all have the power to fight for ourselves, to reclaim what has been stolen. It's never too late. Her words felt powerful, the story of her betrayal woven into every sentence, but now it was about more than. She wasn't alone in her fight. The faces in the crowd, many of them victims of similar injustice, nodded in understanding. She was speaking for all of them now. My son tried to take everything from me, but he didn't know the strength I had inside me, Helen continued, her voice carrying the weight of 100 battles fought in silence. He thought he could erase my worth, but what he didn't realize is that respect is non-refundable. It's something you cannot take, not if you've never earned it, and once it's gone forever. Helen paused, letting her words settle in the air. She saw Emily's face soften with pride, her eyes glistening as she beamed up at her. Rachel gave her a subtle smile of approval, her quiet confidence unwavering. Helen took a deep breath before finishing, her voice now strong, resolute. I didn't just fight for myself. I fought for every person who's been made to feel small, for every person who's been told they didn't matter. I stood up because I knew that the only way to take back control was to speak my truth. And today, I am proud to stand here and say, this is my victory. A wave of applause rippled through the room, growing louder and louder until the entire hall was on its. Helen stood still, her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't move. The applause was more than just for her. It was for all the survivors who had never been. It was for every person who had been told their voice didn't matter. As the applause began to subside, Helen smiled softly, the weight of everything finally settling. She had reclaimed her peace. She had reclaimed her voice. She looked over to Emily, who was clapping the hardest, her face radiant with pride. Helen nodded to her, a silent thank you in her gaze. Emily had been the one to help her find the courage to speak again, and now it was Emily's future, free from the chains of her parents' betrayal, that Helen had fought for. With a final glance at the audience, at the faces of strangers who had become allies in this fight, Helen whispered to herself as she stepped down from the stage. When the flight attendant announced my name, it wasn't a seat they upgraded, it was me. The room was still buzzing with energy, the standing ovation continuing as Helen made her way back to her. She had fought a long, hard battle, and today, she had won. The world had finally heard her voice, and nothing could take that away.